Hi, this is Molly D'Agostino. I'm the Policy Director for the Three Revolutions program here at UC Davis, and I am happy to have you join us for today's webinar. It's Tuesday, March 10th, and we're here at UC Davis for a webinar on state automated vehicle policy. The question we're asking today is state automated vehicle policy keeping up with technology? We want to note before we get into it that this is a changing topic and that the materials that we go over today are accurate and valid for today, but as you'll find, this is a changing topic, so we will have to revisit the findings as new legislation emerges. So first, I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Kelly Fleming, policy analyst at UC Davis the UC Davis Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy. Kelly is a policy analyst with the Policy Institute, where she provides analysis of world-leading research for equitable, economic, sustainable energy and transportation policy solutions. She has a BS from the Colorado School of the Mines and an MS and PhD from the University of Washington in chemical engineering. Previously, Dr. Fleming served as a AAAS fellow, as a Science and Technology Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy, and she joined us here at UC Davis after. So we are thrilled to have Kelly on our team, and I'm also going to introduce our guest respondent, Doug Schinkel, who is the Transportation Program Director for the National Conference of State Legislatures. Doug is the Transportation Policy Director and has worked at NCSL for 14 years on transportation, traffic safety, and connected on automated vehicles, as well as shared mobility issues. So we're so thrilled to have both Doug and Dr. Fleming with us, and we encourage you all to listen closely and ask some questions at the end. If you do have questions during the talk, you can ask those using the Q&A function of your Zoom platform. And please ask any questions, technical questions, on the chat, but save your content questions for the Q&A platform. Thank you so much, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Fleming. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the intro, Molly. So the webinar we're presenting today is a summary of a report that we have coming out shortly, which is analyzing state AV policy. So following this webinar, when the link for the recording comes out, we'll also include a link for the published report that you can have then. So I want to give a little bit of background into why we're interested in this. The UC Davis Policy Institute and the Three Revolutions program has previously published reports and policy briefs that have recommended policies to help result in the best possible outcomes for AVs. So that includes policies to decrease emissions while also improving mobility access and equity in transportation, and improving the safety of vehicle passengers as well as pedestrians and cyclists. So you can find more detail in our recommendations on our website, and those briefs there's some snapshots shown on the screen. So in this paper, we wanted to take a closer look, inspired by the NCSL database, on what exactly states are doing. So we performed an analysis on the database of the trends we saw related to what types of policies were being enacted, like the permissiveness or restrictiveness of policies that states were passing. We wanted to know if they were considering the environment when they were enacting policies. And using this analysis, we've formulated a roadmap and recommendations for states to begin developing and preparing for more widespread deployment of AVs. So just a little history on AVs for the context of how far we've come today. Vehicles have become more and more automated over time. So if you think back to the pull start, that has become automated into things like an ignition start. We have power steering and automatic transmission. Those are all types of automated features. And just in the last 20 years, fully self-driving vehicles have become more of a reality. The first automated vehicle that was started being developed was Carnegie Mellon University's Nav Lab in 1984, and that's shown on the left here. That's the first iteration of a fully self-driving car. And in the last 2 decades, companies like Google's Waymo have taken that technology so far that the car on the right has successfully been tested thousands of miles on freeways without any driver engagement in multiple cities. So thanks to these advancements, self-driving features like adaptive cruise control, automatic braking, and lane keeping have started to become standard on many new models. More fully self-driving features are currently being tested on roads and in vehicles like Waymo and Cruise and Zoox, for example. But after several high-profile crashes in these AVs, more attention has been cast into what policy approaches we're taking for them. The most obvious reason is to implement policies related to safety of consumers. High-profile crashes like the Uber collision in Chandler, Arizona, and several crashes involving drivers using Tesla's autopilot without any understanding of the warnings have brought these concerns more front and center. They've also raised questions about who's liable when a crash occurs, particularly if the car is owned by a fleet operator like a transportation network company or a TNC, which is Uber and Lyft, and what type of insurance structure should be in place. This has highlighted that policies are not necessarily ahead of technology and have left open questions for the integration of AVs into our current transportation system. And so we want to note that AVs do have the potential to improve many aspects of our lives, but in addition to safety, we're also concerned about increasing carbon dioxide and particulate emissions as a result of automation. Multiple studies have come out showing that TNCs are increasing congestion. Just a couple weeks ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists published a report showing that TNCs are likely increasing emissions compared to personally owned vehicles. But imagine now that TNCs no longer had the cost of a driver, and the cost per mile was maybe less than that of transit or a bike share. This could, for example, cause the problem to become exacerbated even more. And there are multiple studies showing this concern. The chart on the right is from the most well-cited study showing that AVs have the potential to either decrease or increase energy use depending on what aspect you're looking at. So features like platooning or eco-driving, which is ride smoothing or reducing accidents, all of those can decrease emissions and congestion. However, there's also a potential to increase emissions if people are taking more trips or changing where they're willing to live or work or travel long distances because of the convenience of automated vehicles. In order for AVs to have the best possible outcome, therefore, policymakers need to start implementing policies to encourage planning for automated vehicles, requiring that they are zero emission and encouraging shared rides. Although people typically imagine that AVs are already electric when they envision the future, that's not currently reality. Most of the high-level, level 4 and level 5 tested vehicles are still combustion engines, and a lot of that is because of the range of the battery is limited by how much computational power is used for the radar technology and LiDAR technology in fully automated vehicles. So historically, many of these regulations have come at the federal level so that vehicles can legally be operated across the country between states. The Obama administration aimed to begin this process for AVs in 2016 by developing automated vehicle principles for the United States Department of Transportation. There have been multiple iterations of these principles, and most recently, a couple of months ago, AV 4.0 was released, which is an update to AV 3.0. These are both from the Trump administration. When AV 3.0 came out, it took more of a hands-off approach at regulation, focusing mostly on safety with only voluntary guidelines for AV operators and manufacturers. They also promised they would roll back any regulations that could be seen as a hindrance to development of these new technologies. And so the 4.0 principles emphasize consistent standards federally so that we can have international partners with clarity, but it never actually lays out what those principles are. It also places emphasis on safety standards and guidelines without any mention of environmental goals or equity considerations. Similarly, Congress has introduced but failed to pass two bills, both in the House and Senate, for similar reasons. Both bills were focused on safety, but failed to gain enough votes because of conflicting concerns over protecting innovative freedom for companies and allowing regulation for safety and environmental concerns. And the lack of federal guidance here has left many of these policies or regulations up to the states. So we wanted to see what approaches states are taking and how that could affect what operators are doing or the way that people are using this technology. So the National Conference of State Legislatures, the NCSL, has compiled a really useful database of all the state executive orders and enacted legislation. It also has a bill tracker, so you can see what bills are pending, which bills have failed, and which bills are going to be enacted in every state in the country. So we analyzed each of these bills that have been enacted or executive orders that have been signed to determine different trends, such as how restrictive or permissive the action was, or whether it's considering regulatory action or removing regulations, or whether it is just laying a foundation for AVs in the future. We also utilize the Global AV Atlas, which was put together by the Aspen Institute and Bloomberg Philanthropies. And it's a database of all of the pilot programs in the world. We just focused on the United States. And we didn't include pilot programs that have not launched yet. These are only pilot programs that are currently in action. And so this is a map that has been adapted from the NCSL database. They have a similar one on their website. And you can see the states shown in the lightest green have enacted some kind of legislation through their state assemblies. And then states in the darker green have executive orders that are related to AVs. States in the blue have both legislation and executive orders, and states in the palest yellow have no enacted legislation or executive orders. And you can see on this map, 40 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia have enacted some form of legislation or executive order related to AVs. So there are 10 that have nothing, and many more have been introduced. This information all came from the NCSL database, as I said, and this is available online. Doug will talk a little bit more about it in the discussion portion. So we wanted to know a little bit more about the motivation and outcomes from this legislation, so we gathered data on pilot programs. So states with pilot programs are outlined in purple, and this information, like I said, was gathered from the Global Atlas project. So these pilots can range from food delivery vehicles, which don't operate on roads, to personal chauffeur projects like what Waymo is testing. And the trend that we saw with these interactions is that states mostly have legislation but don't have active pilot programs. So that made us think that pilot programs are not what's driving states to pass legislation. But you can see that almost every state with a pilot program does have some legislation, with the only exception being Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a pilot program but doesn't have any action legislating the way that pilot is running. So we wanted to further analyze what types of policies have been implemented if they're not necessarily being driven by these pilot programs. So one of the main themes that we ended up seeing was that the most common type of legislation that has been passed are platooning laws. Enacted legislation related to platooning is typically the removal of the following too closely law for vehicles that are operating in platoons. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, a vehicle platoon is when vehicles have the capability to communicate with each other and potentially infrastructure so that they can follow at short distances and harmonize and optimize speeds, braking, and acceleration. So that's typically an energy benefit. This is the technology that's likely going to be first utilized in the long-haul trucking industry along open freeways. So of the states that have enacted legislation related to platooning, there are 9 that only have platooning legislation, and there are 17 that have enacted some type of legislation related to platooning. And you can see the states marked with a star on this map have only passed legislation related to platooning or signed an executive order related to platooning. So based on that analysis, we wanted to investigate how permissive or restrictive the policies each state were enacting were. So we came up with a scoring system to map where each of these states was in their preparation for AVs. A score of a -1 indicates a ban or a restriction on allowing level 4 or level 5 AVs, or in other words, requiring that a driver is able to take over the operation of the vehicle. A score of 0 means that there is no enacted legislation or executive order, and that would be a default to whatever the minimum federal guidance is. A score of 1 indicates that a state has basic legislation or an executive order, and that would be a state that establishes a preliminary step like convening a commission or a research study to study impacts, or designating an authority, or just defining what the technology is. A score of a 2 is more permissive, where a policy is removing restrictions for AVs, like removing the following too closely law, even if they must be permitted before they can drive on the roads. And then a score of a 3 is the most permissive score, where policy explicitly makes AVs legal on public roads with or without guidance for regulation or minimum standards. And so when we mapped those trends, you can see here, each state scored on the scale that I just described, and states in red are -1. You can see the District of Columbia is the only one with that score. States in the gray don't have any legislation, and depending on interpretation, this could be either the most permissive law, because there's no federal guidance. It could mean that untested or unlicensed AVs are technically legal on public roads. The states in the light blue scored a 1, meaning they have preliminary rules like the committee or definition. This is the most common status where states are with in regards to their AV policy. The middle shade of blue shows states with a score of 2, meaning that they're removing restrictions. There are 3 states with this status: Arkansas, Alabama, and Ohio. And then states in the darkest blue scored a 3, meaning that they're authorizing the use of AVs without any legislation to regulate or standardize them. 2 of these meet that criteria: Arizona and Illinois. So we're going to go over a few examples of these states so that you can better understand the way that we scored the -1 through 3. So the first example is Colorado, and I just want to say you don't need to read all the text. Don't be intimidated by the amount of text on this slide. This is the text from the NCSL database, just to highlight the way that we scored. So Colorado, the only legislation it has passed is for preliminary steps, defining what an AV system is, guidelines for the State Department of Transportation to submit a report related to testing. It also requires approval for vehicle testing, such as following too closely, and this is a preliminary step for safety regulations. And then finally, it requires a report on the testing of the outcomes. So then the next state, California, got a score of a 2, and it doesn't ban any vehicles, but it also doesn't remove any restrictions necessarily. So California is also unique in that it has the most enacted bills of any state, with 8 of them, and it has the most comprehensive policy landscape of any state related to these policies. So I just highlighted 3 of them here. One of the trends that we were also interested when we first decided to do this report was to see if any states or which states were implementing environmental goals. And we found that California is the only one doing that. So you can see SB1, the first highlighted bill, explicitly sets aside funding for AV infrastructure and highlights zero emission infrastructure in particular. SB 1298 is one of the bills that directs the agencies to test and license vehicles so that they can drive on public roadways. And then one of the most recent bills is SB 1014, which implements regulations to track and reduce greenhouse gas emissions for transportation network companies, but it has language to assume that some of those will include automated vehicles in the future. Arizona is one of the states that scored a 3, and it has explicit authorization to drive on public roads. So this is the executive order that the governor signed, and they don't have any active legislation to regulate this, but the executive order directs the state to make sure that AVs are able to operate on public roadways. And the purpose of this was to encourage innovative companies to come to Arizona to test their technologies. However, with the lack of standards, when the Uber collision occurred, there has been a little bit of scrutiny into whether or not that's the right approach. And then the District of Columbia was the only territory that had a score of -1, and the legislation highlighted here doesn't explicitly state that AVs are banned, but it does require that a human driver is able to take over operation of the vehicle. So by definition, that means that some level 4 and level 5 vehicles are not allowed to be operated in the district if it doesn't have like a steering wheel or pedals so that a driver can take over. It also restricts what types of AVs are allowed to be driven on roads. And there's other legislation in the district that's more comprehensive for goals related to equity and access to mobility. So the next aspect we were interested in after those findings were how states are actually regulating AVs. So this map shows the regulatory status of states using two metrics, whether they have any policies that are regulating and whether they have designated a regulatory authority. So the states in the pale teal have not taken any regulatory action by designating an authority or passing legislation or an executive order. States in the darker teal have designated a regulatory agency for AVs, either for testing and licensing or for the business side of things, or both. States in blue have enacted legislation with regulatory guidance like testing approval or minimum safety standards. And then states in the dark blue have done both. They've designated regulatory authorities and enacted some type of regulatory action. So most of these policies are for testing and licensing requirements to make sure that AVs are safe and legal. This type of action requires an authority to implement it, and interestingly, Michigan and Maine are the only two states that have enacted these types of policies, but haven't designated which entity is in charge of them. More often, states have designated an authority in preparation for a regulation, but haven't actually enacted any yet. And then most commonly, states have designated their departments of transportation to lead study impacts or implement policies, and that's why we see more of these states that have designated authorities without actually passing a policy yet. State DMVs are often commonly designated for testing and permitting, but we see that as AVs will impact many different areas of society, full implementation will require multiple authorities likely. So we have here a table, and this will be in the report, the full table with all of the states instead of just a snapshot, but here's an example of the way that these vehicles are being regulated. So some states have designated specific agencies in charge of automated vehicles. Commonly, like I said, the state departments of transportation are managing regulations or managing the studies and testing for these vehicles. However, every state has already designated an authority or multiple authorities that are regulating transportation network companies. And these are commonly public utility commissions or state DOTs. And we can kind of assume that if TNCs implement AVs as their mobility as a service model, that the TNC regulators will also be the regulators for AVs. And like I said, the full table in this report will be available when we send you the link for the published report. Based on the analysis that we conducted for the current state policies, we've laid out a roadmap of recommendations for states to implement. So this figure outlines the policy roadmap, and some states are somewhere on this map, and some of them have no enacted policies. But no state has adopted this entire roadmap. So first, we recommend that states implement some sort of preliminary legislation, including like a study or commission, and studying the impacts that AVs will have on their unique region. It could designate a group to do this or define AV technology so that everyone's on the same page. Many states have already taken this step. Additionally, this could include a ban of some kind until more information is known, like DC has done. Next, we recommend that states start implementing requirements and standards. Ideally, the federal government would also implement minimum requirements for road operation. However, states now should implement additional standards based on their own needs and establish a minimum guidance that could be used for interoperability between states. Rules and regulations can also be added for businesses the way that they are for TNCs to operate in states. and there should be required testing or demonstration for licensing and permitting and operational guidance. Finally, there should also be consideration for, sorry, I'm behind on my transitions here. Finally, there should be consideration for liability and insurance requirements in the event of a collision. And then following these regulatory actions, authorities in charge of enforcing those regulations should be designated. Again, ideally, the federal government would implement the United States Department of Transportation and NHTSA in charge of these safety standards, but in absence, states should designate either state DOTs or another agency to oversee these laws. Environmental regulations should also be designated to either state EPAs or air quality offices with licensing requirements to DMVs. And like I said, every state has designated a regulatory body for TNCs or mobility as a service. And keeping that in mind, we should continue designating authorities to manage AVs when they are used as a business. So based on the roadmap, we have several recommendations that states should take as they're developing their policies. First, we recommend that they designate regulatory roles as they implement regulatory policies to help avoid confusion over preemption locally and federally. They should specify which entity is responsible for each regulatory scheme, including environmental regulations, safety and testing and licensing and registration. To clarify requirements for operators and AV innovators, states should establish minimum safety and liability requirements to operate AVs on public roads. These requirements should also define the roles of local governments, including testing standards, licensing requirements, and liability requirements. Liability requirements should also be reconciled with current liability rules in each jurisdiction to avoid confusion. State policymakers should also coordinate with each other to align regulations and standards so that they can easily be driven across state lines and safely driven across state lines, especially in areas where major cities straddle state boundaries like Washington, D.C., Kansas City, and Portland. Minimum standards should be unified enough that vehicles can legally be driven across state lines as well. Policies can also be implemented to help states and cities meet their greenhouse gas reduction goals with automated vehicles. For example, UC Davis has recommended previously policies that can incentivize shared and pooled travel, require zero-emission vehicles, and improve access to transportation to underserved communities. We recommend that states align their AV policies with their greenhouse gas reduction goals, and legislative action could be taken so that the federal government can't preempt local action on emissions. We also recommend to achieve congestion and emissions improvement that states incentivize mobility as a service providers to operate in a shared fleet. This could be achieved with safety standards or incentives on pricing or setting emissions per passenger mile rather than vehicle mile standards the way that California has done. And then finally, we recommend states require data reporting from AV providers to cities and states and federal policymakers. This will help companies ensure collection and compliance before they are widespread, as well as being able to safeguard privacy for users. And the reporting of this data will help states and cities better plan for the impacts of AVs before they're widespread instead of reacting and needing to change behavior after they've already been adopted. So our conclusion for this study is that AV policies, they do vary widely across states, and this could create issues in the future for interoperability and reacting in a way that we're then needing to change behavior to get the best possible outcomes. We found several trends in common legislation, including the most common legislation being platooning, and there are specific definitions and exemptions for platooning. Those are common legislative actions, as well as the most common legislation being preliminary exploration of policy strategies like convening studies and committees. We recommend unified policy approaches so that operators, developers, and users of the AVs have a better idea of what to expect and can plan ahead. We also note that multiple aspects of AVs will require regulatory authorities, not just for safety reasons, but also environmental, planning, and equity. And implementing AV policy before the widespread deployment of AVs will be more effective than reacting and designing policies after people have already started behavioral patterns to ensure benefit. So with that, I will hand it over to Doug for our discussion portion. Go ahead, Doug.
Hello, thank you, Kelly. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks for your remarks, Kelly, and going through that and for the opportunity to participate. So I'll just take a few minutes to go over kind of my thoughts on Kelly's presentation, and then talk a little bit about some of the trends that I'm seeing. So maybe the best way to think about this to begin with is that state lawmakers, of course, are kind of they're generalists. They're jacks of all trades. They have to be ideally well-read on a number of policy issues. And as I kind of had discussed with Kelly and Molly when we discussed about this webinar before, I think lawmakers certainly understand and appreciate the potential transformative power of driverless technology. But at the end of the day, it's not something that constituents are necessarily banging on their door about or asking about, and there's not really a pressing need to legislate at the moment. Now that depends on the opinion and orientation of the individual lawmakers, but generally the sense I get from the amount of legislation I'm seeing, but also from talking with legislators, is they don't feel the urgency to necessarily legislate on this, in part because they're not clear exactly perhaps what they should be legislating on, and they don't want to send signals to kind of the driverless technology industry that could be interpreted as being overly regulatory and what have you. So I think that lawmakers are approaching this topic with a lot of optimism, but also with with a degree of cautiousness to make sure that they're not moving too quickly. You know, these services, meaning the driverless technology, it, for the most part, doesn't really exist on our roads yet in a way where it's actually functioning and carrying passengers or carrying freight. Now, there are certainly exceptions to that, and I was actually lucky enough to ride in one of the driverless vehicles. I mean, it had an actual safety driver in it, but a Waymo 1 vehicle that was in driverless mode, and that was, you know, very impressive. But until you, as a legislator, have a better sense of what you need to legislate on and what are the issues that you need to work through, I think there is a lot of being just cautious and moving slow. And that's reflected in some of the conversations I've had with lawmakers. I will note, I think someone asked the questions in the Q&A about how often our database is updated. And I try to do it every 2 weeks to a month. I just updated, I believe, last week, and there's 26 states with 96 bills thus far in 2020. So a good amount of bills, but once again, not like an overwhelming amount. And I can go into and talk a little bit about the trends I'm seeing there. I think in terms of why lawmakers are legislating on these topics, the sense I get from reading the bills, but also from talking with lawmakers, is that they do want to, you know, they are of course intrigued by the safety, the potential safety benefits, given that there are, you know, around 37,000 some traffic safety deaths every year in the US, give or take. Obviously the potential mobility benefits, especially for the transportation disadvantage. But I get the sense that a lot of why lawmakers are wanting to legislate is kind of along these same lines of what Kelly is kind of laid out with, like permissiveness. If they are legislating, they're trying to mostly do it in a way that is not restrictive, and is trying to set some clear definitions, some clear roles, and that often involves perhaps the state DOT or the state Department of Licensing or Motor Vehicles, and to set up some sort of clear framework for how testing and or operation in the state can be undertaken. And so I do think it really is like a lot of lawmakers are looking at this through the economic development lens. You know, Kelly touched on this, and I think it's hard to try and suss out, and Kelly did a really good job of whether does legislation equal a better or more permissive AV regulatory environment. You know, it really does depend on the legislation, and I think Kelly's scoring system made a good attempt at trying to kind of figure that out. I think that where the industry is and where governments are at this point, that the relationship aspect of this is all very important, that a state may not have any laws, or they may have an executive order, or they may have one but not the other, but really probably the amount of interaction with the state DOT, and I know we have a lot of people from state DOTs on this webinar, and just kind of a comfort level with the leadership in the states, the pertinent agencies and the governor and the legislature. I think that's very important. Of course, the legislation can be very important as well, but I think you'll get different opinions within the driverless technology kind of industry about that. I wanted to note that, you know, it has been interesting thus far. I haven't really seen that much legislation that is making a explicit connection between autonomy and emissions. Certainly states are doing many things around transportation emissions at the moment, particularly as it relates to electric vehicle infrastructure and incentives for adoption of electric vehicles, although states are also putting in place electric vehicle fees to make up for some of the decline in gas tax revenue. So that does cut a little bit both ways. But in terms of the kind of shared mobility and ride-hailing angle, there have been a few states that have put in place legislation and language detailing, kind of defining what a driverless or autonomous transportation network company ride-hailing service is, and what the kind of rules and regulations for that. Not going into a lot of detail yet, but just making it clear that that service kind of could be provided at some point. Nevada, California, North Dakota, and there's a few other states that have kind of defined some of those the transportation network company driverless services and put in place some regulatory frameworks. So I'd encourage you to look at those pieces of legislation on in my database or on the associated page that summarize all the most of the laws that state legislatures have enacted thus far. I would also say too, and you know, it's sometimes I saw a couple of the Q&A, and I think I will just weigh in terms of you know, the kind of debate over, okay, the permissiveness, and we think we should be a 2 and a 1, and this is all very difficult to suss out. And also the idea of, whether there are pilots in a state or not. And that's also something that's hard to figure out. I found that trying to catalog that, and I'd be really interested if someone has the most, like, kind of has an actual page that compiles that, but it's really hard to understand, you know, what is being tested or even operated, and really what the difference between testing and operation is in a state. But I think those are my remarks for the moment. I'm looking forward to weighing in on the question and answers, but I want to leave plenty of time for those questions, so I'll stop there. And people are free to reach out to me at my email address, douglas.schinkel@ncsl.org, which you can see here on the slide, and ask me questions individually after this presentation. But thanks again for the opportunity, and looking forward to chatting with the attendees.
Great. I think this is, thank you so much, Doug. Really appreciate your input there. And, you know, of course, we thank you so much for the fact that this database exists. There's no perfect way to classify all this stuff. So we appreciate folks' feedback on how we can better classify information. I do see a couple questions on the Q&A asking for a reclassification, and we are very open to that. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us individually. I don't think I want to spend time during the webinar chat to talk about those individual cases, but we're all ears and we haven't yet published the paper. So we certainly can hear from you if you think that there's some criteria that we're not understanding properly. So I'm not skipping those questions, but we are today. But we will come back to them, and we really do hope that you reach out, and we'll reach out to you if not. So that said, what I'd like to do is cover some of the more broader questions first, and then we can dive into some of the more specific questions so we get to them. We get to the big questions first. So I think one of the questions I want to ask is about data reporting requirements. And so I think this is a question that it's possible that our speakers have some expertise on, and we can talk broadly about what California is doing as well. But have any states developed specific data reporting requirements that you've seen, and what do you think are some of those data reporting requirements that are needed?
Okay, I'll try to answer. I don't, in the legislation, and correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, I don't remember seeing any requirements for data reporting. Potentially DC, but I can't remember for sure if they did. And Molly actually wrote a paper on this, and you can find it on our website. There's a policy brief and an extensive white paper on our recommendations for data reporting and repositories. There's a lot of work being done here for micromobility companies. Remind me what the MDS stands for. The
Mobility Data Specification, yeah.
Mobility Data Specification is a new database that just started to require this type of reporting in cities. And I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
No. Thank you for mentioning this work. And I think what's important to mention is that California is considering this, and we'd love to hear from other states. This webinar is a great opportunity, it sounds like, for us to get together and hear from other states on what they are considering, because it's difficult to find the information on what is being considered. So please reach out to us if you can inform, and we can improve our dialogue there. So moving quickly on to other questions that were asked. I think a question was asked about was asked for Doug specifically. From the NCSL perspective, are you aware of any congressional caucus groups that are beginning to form around AVs?
Yeah, so actually not to punt on this question, but I only handle our interactions in terms of tracking what states are doing. And I, of course, try and keep an eye on what's going on federally, but I have a colleague, his name is Ben Hush, who leads up our federal work. And so I can check with him on that, Ted, if you want to reach out to me separately. My recollection is that there is a caucus group that is focused on these issues, but I'm not positive on that, but I can check on that.
Great. Great. So I have a question that the question was asked by Jacob Wasserman that is quite forward-looking. So I wonder to what extent our panelists can speak to where you see the future going for AV taxes and fees. Tennessee and Nevada have already passed them, and there's a bill number listed in the comment here. So again, thank you for that comment, because we are using this as an opportunity to learn about the pending legislation. So for the future of AV policy, let's broaden that, the future of AV policy, and especially if you see AV taxes and fees as part of that future. Kelly, would you like to start us?
Sure. I tend to look at what states are doing for TNCs before as kind of a precursor to what they're going to do when AVs are implemented. And you can see there are a few states, it's not in this database, but there are several states that have begun passing taxes and fees on TNCs to help alleviate congestion, and that is either per passenger or per ride. And there is some debate up for the best way to do that, to encourage pooling but without penalizing drivers and riders who choose to do pooled rides. I don't know. Doug, do you have any insights?
I do. And so specifically, I'd have to look at the Nevada bill again, but I know that actually, I believe that Tennessee bill, the tax that was proposed that was in there was removed, was not in the final version. And it's a little confusing when you look at the Tennessee website. So if the person asking that question wants to reach out to me separately offline, I can confirm that. But what I would say more generally is when I made the comments kind of earlier about the fact that, in the grand scheme of things, legislators certainly understand and are optimistic about I think cautiously optimistic about the future of driverless technology, but it's not necessarily something pressing on their plate. This kind of idea, the problem of revenue is something that legislatures are very focused on because, absent a kind of full federal partnership, states have really had to step up in terms of increasing their gas taxes, increasing electric vehicle fee, or creating and increasing electric vehicle fees, and setting the stage for road usage charges in their state. I don't think that, from what I've talked to, I don't really get the sense, and from things I've seen in legislation, that lawmakers are focused on taxing driverless technology specifically. I think what they're really focused on and trying to figure out what is a supplement to the gas tax and then a replacement for the gas tax. And obviously, if you have a road usage charge system, which Utah and Oregon now small scale, and Virginia just is about to pass something, have something enacted that I believe creates a pilot there. And there's of course a number of other states with pilots, not necessarily operational programs. But I think that's really where the conversation is, and acknowledging that there's going to be a transition away from internal combustion engines. There is, I did remember seeing too, I believe that California passed a bill specific clarifying that TNC type services that are driverless in San Francisco specifically could be taxed. And I think that was put in place in anticipation that would maybe happen sooner in that market than other areas. But thus far, otherwise, going back to my original point, I don't think lawmakers are generally really interested in sending signals that are going to kind of repel the driverless technology industry from operating or setting up some sort of presence in their state. So I think they're pretty reluctant to go in that direction at the moment. And so those are my kind of comments there.
And Doug's comment reminded me, we do have a report that just came out yesterday, which is supplementing another report related to the EV fees that have been passed. And it analyzes the alternatives to the gas tax and how best they can kind of make up for the shortfall in the funding from the gas tax or replace the gas tax. So that's a report that Alan Jen published with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation here at UC Davis. And then he also published a report to the legislature at the beginning of last year. It's an SB1 report on how particularly in California, the $100 flat EV fee is helping supplement the shortfall in transportation funding.
And this, as Kelly mentioned, was funded through a partnership between the UC Institute of Transportation Studies and the California Legislature through SB1, which is our recent transportation tax measure, legislation.
Yeah. I also want to mention that Molly and I are actually co-authoring a report that will be released soon on analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile requirements that California passed with SB 1014 and the ways that those can be implemented. So that's not published yet, but keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, so we have a number of resources that we could provide people as, so get on our list so we can be sure you see our publications as they emerge. So that said, let's continue asking some of these fantastic questions. I think a question that we have that is about basically this tension between state and federal policy. So an anonymous attendee asked about the threat to federal vehicle safety regulation. And I want to speak to this concern around preemption, and ask our speakers to just address that concern, is whether states are taking action now to address concerns about federal preemption, or they're playing more of a wait and see. Doug, do you have any thoughts on this, or?
Yeah, yeah. So I always find it kind of humorous when I hear these terms like patchwork thrown around, and this kind of boogeyman that states are acting and legislating in a manner that in some way is antagonistic or inhibiting the success of OEMs and manufacturers, operating in the driverless technology world. I just don't think the evidence is there to point to that. You look at most of these pieces of legislation, and they were crafted for the most part in close collaboration with the very industry, and really trying to be partners and think about how can we, and when you think about a lot of what states are doing, it is partnerships. So look at Drive Ohio, or what they're doing in Michigan, or what they're doing in Utah, or what they're doing in Arizona. And in many of instances, they're trying to put in place maybe some common definitions. In some of those states, they don't even have legislation. Sometimes they have executive orders, which are more flexible and also aren't statutorily in law, so they go away, which can be good and bad. But I really don't see that states are doing anything that's inhibiting this industry. I think certainly at some point in the future, it'll be helpful to have more guidance from the federal government, and have a regulatory framework. A regulatory framework as it applies to the vehicles themselves. States are not interested in certifying, kind of like creating vehicle standards. And it's very clear that there's different traditional roles for the federal government versus state government, and NCSL and the states we work with and represent are not interested in getting into these kind of responsibility roles that we traditionally have not had. But I think what we're doing at the moment is working okay. I think it speaks to this kind of success of that we have these laboratories of democracy, and we have these kind of laboratories of driverless technology testing going on right now. And it allows different manufacturers and different technology groups to work in different states, in different conditions, in different weather, and to really build up an awareness base with a lot of different stakeholders. They're going to be important because at the end of the day, people like mayors, state lawmakers, heads of DOTs, governors, et cetera, they're going to play an important role in communicating to the public that yes, we believe that we do or we do not believe that this technology is now at the place where it's road ready, and we should be started to be unveiled in a way that's actually a lot of service being provided. Public elected officials are going to have to make that case. And to kind of speak to another question that was thrown in there, kind of asking about what's the stakeholder stakeholder process. There are now at least, I think, around 15, maybe even 20 states that have formal task forces or work groups, some of them established internally within a DOT, some of them established by executive order, some established by state legislatures. And those groups, typically have a pretty good broad cross section of some kind of public interest stakeholders, but then a lot of the relevant agencies to kind of start having these conversations. And so those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Doug. So we have a number of questions, and we won't be able to get through them all today. I want to point out that there's a question asked about liability, and we have 4 papers written on this topic that we published last year, 2018, actually, I think. So they're a little bit outdated, but they're more conceptual. So we can share those with the groups too. We have addressed the question of liability. So with our final question, I think we wanted to ask a question about stakeholders. Excuse me, I'm trying to remember where it is. Dan Wu from the California Department of Public Health, hi Dan, asks, do either speaker know much about stakeholder input in informing state AV policies? Are community and advocacy groups like transportation equity, environmental, and public health groups participating in state AV policy development at this point? And I want to point out that this is going to be our last question, so let's keep it relatively brief, but if we go over just a couple minutes, that's okay, and we'll publish this, the recording from this, as well as the follow up with any individual questions that weren't able to be addressed today.
Yeah, so I don't have an intimate knowledge of how every state is doing this. I do know that California has taken a lot of thoughtful remarks into consideration when informing these types of policies. They have open comment periods, and UC Davis itself has organized several meetings to help inform these policies, where we bring in different stakeholder input from companies, the TNC companies, equity groups, environmental justice groups. And I imagine many states are doing this, and I imagine several states are not doing this. But this is a discussion I think would be really useful to have with some of the participants on the phone. So again, this is like a good way to learn what other states are doing and things that aren't written into legislative documents, and learning best practices from each other. I don't know if Doug has any other knowledge of this.
Yeah, so my earlier apply in terms of this, all the states creating these formal structures to have these discussions, task force work groups, what have you. I would note that one such example that I would kind of highlight is Minnesota. They had a, excuse me, executive order under their previous previous governor, and have reissued a slightly different one under the new one, continuing the task force. But they put out a report with a number of really weighty and detailed recommendations in a number of subtopic areas. And they really touched on a lot of areas. And so I think that, and they also, Minnesota made the best effort that I could see in that, rather than it being just a kind of discussion amongst kind of agency officials and official kind of appointed representatives, they actually went out and held forums throughout the state. So I think that's something that's really would be a worthwhile activity for other states to consider. Once again, just because, like I said, you have to bring the public along on this, and some of the surveys are showing the public's acceptance of driverless technology is kind of shaky, and there still is some skepticism. And so talking about this is important. So I would really highlight what Minnesota did is what feels like a best practice to me.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we're running to the end of our webinar here, but there are a number of great questions that we didn't get to answer today. So we'll do our best at answering those questions that we can, and providing information to folks that reach out. We encourage you to reach out to both Kelly and Doug for clarification for questions, and we hope this does, as both have said, create a new dialogue where we can work with state DOTs and other state legislative folks, so we can, be working together and providing resources. That is our goal, and we're so happy to have you all today here. And we will send out an email with a number of things, a survey that will ask you just to provide us feedback on how we can improve our webinar series, and how we did today, and also with some information about the presentation itself, the slides, etc. So we'll keep an eye out for that communication from us. And with that, we will close the webinar. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Kelly and Doug.